Welcome back to our channel, where we uncover the secrets and scandals hidden inside the royal family. If you want the truth behind palace walls, this is the place to be. Before we dive into today's shocking story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because what you're about to hear is only the beginning of a royal reset that could change the monarchy forever. Trust me, you don't want to miss what comes next. Now, let's set the stage. King Charles, at 76 years old, is facing perhaps the most painful and humiliating moment of his reign. For decades he fought for Camilla, against the press, against public opinion, and against his own family's judgment. He crowned her as queen, gave her influence and presence, and defended her at every turn. But now, after years of loyalty, Charles has been confronted with brutal ultimatum from those closest to him: his own son, Prince William, and his sister, Princess Anne. According to palace insiders, William and Anne have privately demanded that Charles cut every single tie, both financial and personal, with Queen Camilla's family. This wasn't a polite request. It was described as a ruthless intervention, one that left Charles in tears. For William, the demand was about protecting the crown, but also about protecting his late mother Diana's legacy. For Anne, it was about defending the integrity of the monarchy, ensuring that personal attachments would not weaken the institution their mother, Queen Elizabeth II, worked her entire life to safeguard. The ultimatum, sources say, struck Charles at his deepest point of vulnerability. Here was a man who had sacrificed everything for Camilla, suddenly told that the people he trusted most no longer believed her family belonged anywhere near the throne. The message was simple. Camilla's children, Laura Lopes and Tom Parker Bowles, had infiltrated royal life for too long. If Charles truly wanted to preserve the crown for William, George and Charlotte, he had to draw the line now. And with that ultimatum, a chain of events was set into motion that would shake Buckingham Palace to its core. Not long after the ultimatum was delivered, the palace released a carefully worded statement that sent shockwaves across the country. At first glance, it appeared to be a routine communication about the future structure of the monarchy. But one detail stood out immediately to royal watchers. Camilla's children were not mentioned at all. This subtle erasure did not go unnoticed. For years, Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopes had been quietly included on the periphery of family events. They weren't royals by title, but they were fixtures in Camilla's world, and by extension, fixtures in Charles's life. Their omission from the announcement was deliberate, signalling something far bigger than an oversight. This was the monarchy drawing a hard line, publicly cutting off Camilla's family from its inner circle. The reaction was instant and explosive. Social media erupted, tabloids plastered the news across front pages, and global networks framed it as nothing less than a royal reset. Hashtags like #Diana's Legacy and #Royal House Cleanse trended for hours, with thousands celebrating the move as long overdue. Many called it justice for Diana, arguing that William had finally stood up to protect his mother's memory from being overshadowed by the woman who replaced her. Others saw it as the monarchy's attempt to regain credibility with the public, who had grown weary of blurred lines between duty and personal indulgence. But beneath the celebration, there was a darker undertone. Whispers began to circulate about just how deeply Camilla's children had been embedded into royal life. Some insiders went as far as to suggest that Tom and Laura had manoeuvred themselves into positions of influence without ever carrying the weight of royal responsibility. It wasn't just a matter of appearances anymore, it was a matter of power. For Prince William, this was the heart of the issue. He reportedly viewed his step-siblings' growing influence as a betrayal, not only to him as the heir, but to the very memory of Diana. And the breaking point, the moment that forced his hand, came when he discovered that Laura Lopes had been quietly very involved in the affairs of the Duchy of Cornwall, the estate now directly tied to William's role as Prince of Wales. That discovery, more than anything else, convinced William that enough was enough. The confrontation reached a new level when Princess Anne decided to step in. Known as one of the most hard-working and plain-spoken members of the royal family, Anne has never shied away from saying what others were too cautious to admit. Behind closed doors, she confronted Charles directly, and her words cut deeper than any public headline ever could. According to insiders, Anne reminded her brother that the monarchy had survived for centuries because it placed duty above personal attachment. She told him in no uncertain terms that weakening the institution for the sake of Camilla's children would dishonour their mother's legacy. Queen Elizabeth II had spent her entire reign protecting the crown from outside influence, and Anne was determined not to let her brother undo that work in just a few years. But Anne's intervention wasn't fuelled by tradition alone. She had seen documents, leaked papers circulating among senior courtiers that painted a troubling picture. These documents revealed that Laura Lopes was being positioned as a potential trustee of certain royal estates. To the public, this meant little. To the insiders, it meant everything. A trustee role would grant Laura significant influence over royal assets, finances, and future decisions, despite her having no blood connection to the monarchy. When news of these papers began to leak beyond palace walls, outrage followed. The press accused Camilla's family of manipulating the system, embedding themselves into royal life, not by birthright, but by quiet manoeuvring. For critics, it looked like a backdoor takeover, with Camilla's children enjoying the privileges of proximity to the crown without bearing the responsibility or scrutiny that came with it. For William, the evidence was damning. For Anne, it was proof of her worst fears. And for Charles, it was the beginning of an impossible choice. Protect the woman he loved and her family, or protect the monarchy he had sworn to uphold. The pressure was unbearable, and for a time, Charles resisted. But as public outrage intensified and support for the crown began to wobble, he realised that a decision could no longer be delayed. The breaking point came in what some insiders have described as the darkest week of Charles's reign so far. Reports of the leaked trustee documents dominated the front pages of every major paper, not only in the United Kingdom, but across the globe. Editorials questioned whether the king had allowed his personal life to cloud his judgment, and commentators openly speculated about the monarchies to survive another scandal. Public trust, which had already been fragile after years of turmoil surrounding Harry and Meghan, was now hanging by a thread. Behind the walls of Buckingham Palace, Charles was said to be tormented. For hours on end, he met with his advisors, weighing the risks of every possible outcome. If he chose to protect Camilla's children, the monarchy could be accused of corruption, favouritism, and manipulation. If he chose to distance himself from them, he would devastate the woman he had loved for more than half his life. It was a decision that no one envied, and yet only he could make it. The tipping point, according to palace aides, came during a private conversation with William. The heir to the throne reportedly looked his father in the eye and told him bluntly, "If you allow this to continue, you will destroy everything." William argued that the monarchy could not afford another blow to its credibility. He reminded Charles that his duty was not to individuals but to the crown itself, and that if sacrifices were required, even painful ones, they had to be made. Anne's intervention further sealed the matter. She is said to have told Charles that she would publicly resign from her duties if he continued allowing Camilla's family to entangle themselves in royal affairs. For Anne, this was not a threat but a vow. She would not stand by and watch the monarchy, the institution her mother had safeguarded so carefully, become vulnerable to outside interests. In the end, Charles yielded. Advisors prepared a formal decree, one that would permanently remove Camilla's family from any connection to royal trusts, estates, or privileges. It was not just a quiet distancing, it was a complete severing. Laura Lopes and Tom Parker Bowles would no longer have access, influence, or involvement of any kind in the workings of the monarchy. When the papers were finally signed, those present described Charles as broken. He was pale, shaken, and visibly emotional, realising that in protecting the crown, he had just inflicted irreparable damage on his marriage. For decades, Camilla had stood beside him as his ally and his confidant. Now, with the stroke of a pen, he had dismantled the bridge between her world and his. The fallout was immediate. Camilla, blindsided by the decision, withdrew from public life almost overnight. Appearances were cancelled, engagements postponed, and speculation about her health and emotional state filled the tabloids. Those close to her described her as devastated, not only by the betrayal of Charles, but by the quiet disappearance of her children from royal visibility. For Tom and Laura, there would be no official statements, no public defence, only silence as they quietly retreated from the spotlight. But for Charles, the damage was twofold. He had preserved the monarchy, yes, but he had also broken the one partnership that had defined the last half of his life. And while William and Anne may have celebrated the outcome as a victory for the crown, the personal cost to the king was almost unbearable. This was not just a political manoeuvre, it was a family imploding under the weight of its own history, its secrets, and its sacrifices. With the decree signed and the palace reshaped, the monarchy entered what many are now calling the era of the royal reset. For the first time in decades, there was a clear line drawn. Only those of blood royal would carry the weight of the crown's privilege and responsibility. No stepchildren, no spouses' families, no outsiders of convenience. The monarchy had been pared down to its core. For William, this was not just a strategic victory, it was a deeply personal one. He had spent much of his life haunted by the shadow of his mother's suffering, by the way Diana's story had been eclipsed by Charles and Camilla's long, controversial love. Now, by forcing this reset, he believed he was honouring her legacy. The monarchy, in his view, could no longer be an extension of Camilla's world. It had to be the institution Diana had envisioned for her sons and eventually her grandchildren. George and Charlotte, he told confidants, deserved a crown that was untangled from the ghosts of scandal. For Princess Anne, the reset meant something different. It was a return to discipline, to a monarchy that existed to serve rather than to indulge. Anne had long been one of the most respected royals, admired for her relentless work ethic and her refusal to seek the limelight. To her, allowing Camilla's family to linger at the edges of power had been not just a mistake, but a betrayal of her mother's memory. With the reset, Anne felt the monarchy had been restored to the principles Queen Elizabeth II had held sacred. But while William and Anne may have found reassurance, Charles was left in ruins. Friends describe him as isolated, wounded, and filled with regret. He still loves Camilla deeply, but their relationship has been irrevocably changed. Once united against the world, they are now divided by the very crown that once bound them together. Those close to the couple whisper that Camilla feels used, cherished when convenient, discarded when her presence threatened the institution. For a woman who had fought decades to be accepted, the humiliation was almost unbearable. And what of Camilla's children? Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopes, once comfortable in their quiet but undeniable access to royal circles, have now vanished from the narrative. No appearances at family gatherings, no mention in palace communications. They have returned to civilian life, their proximity to power erased in an instant. For some, this is justice. For others, it is a reminder of how ruthless the monarchy can be when survival is on the line. The royal reset, however, is not without risk. While many celebrated the bloodline-only approach, critics argue that it has left the monarchy colder, more insular, and dangerously dependent on a shrinking circle of working royals. If one thing goes wrong, if scandal, illness, or tragedy strikes, the institution may find itself with too few hands to carry the load. In saving itself from infiltration, the monarchy may have made itself more vulnerable than ever. And yet, for now, William stands taller than before. His authority is strengthened, his role as heir solidified, his children's future more secure. George, Charlotte, and Louis represent a new generation, one that the public is eager to embrace. But the cost of this victory has been enormous. A wife left devastated, a king left broken, a family left fractured in ways that may never truly heal. So as Britain watches this new chapter unfold, one question lingers above all others. Was this royal reset a necessary act of preservation, or the beginning of the end for a monarchy that seems to eat its own in order to survive? One thing is certain, history will remember this moment not just as a scandal, but as a turning point when love, loyalty, and legacy collided, and only the crown survived. In the weeks that followed, the dust began to settle, but the scars remained. Courtiers described the atmosphere inside Buckingham Palace as heavy, almost funereal, with every glance and whispered conversation carrying the weight of what had been lost. This wasn't a scandal that could simply be buried in the archives of history. It was a decision that reshaped the monarchy itself. For Charles, the silence was perhaps the hardest part. Gone were the evenings filled with Camilla's laughter and the quiet comfort of her family's presence. In their place was a deep void, one he filled with state papers, briefings, and endless official duties, but never with peace. Some say the king has aged visibly in these few short months, carrying on his shoulders not just the crown, but the personal heartbreak of a man who had to choose duty over love. Camilla, meanwhile, has withdrawn almost entirely from the public stage. Once hailed as a symbol of Charles's resilience and defiance, she now appears as the monarchy's most tragic casualty. Her children, who never asked for crowns or titles, have been made pariahs in the eyes of the institution. Their erasure is so complete that palace insiders whisper about a ghost protocol, a quiet order ensuring their names never appear again in official records, speeches, or royal communications. But beyond the palace walls, the debate rages on. Some argue that William and Anne saved the monarchy from being slowly consumed by outsiders who had no rightful claim to influence. Others accuse them of cruelty, of turning the crown into a fortress so exclusive that even those closest to the king were expelled. Public opinion is sharply divided. Was this act of cleansing a triumph of discipline or a betrayal of compassion? Historians are already weighing in. Comparisons are being drawn to past crises. Edward VIII's abdication for Wallis Simpson, the exile of Andrew, the bitter rift with Harry. But this, many argue, is different. It is not just one royal falling from grace, but an entire family branch cut away in a single stroke. It is a demonstration of the monarchy's ability to self-correct, but also a stark reminder of its brutality. And then there is the question of succession. William now stands as the undeniable centre of the monarchy's future, but his rise has come at the cost of his father's happiness. George and Charlotte, still children, are already being prepared for a destiny that looks far more rigid than the one their grandfather envisioned. The bloodline has been secured, yes, but at what cost to humanity? As the cameras flash and the public applauds the new era of discipline, behind the gilded gates, the pain of the reset lingers. A king who sacrificed love, a queen who feels abandoned, a family forever changed. The monarchy may have survived this storm, but the question that haunts it now is not whether it can endure, but whether it can ever heal.